At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
Quiet Riot.
Welcome to Quiet Riot. I'm Alex Andreou. Who is Paul Marshall? What drives him? And why should you care? Paul Marshall is the co-founder and chairman of Marshall Wace, one of Europe's largest hedge fund groups, founded in 1997. He's an investor, a philanthropist, and a political donor. But more recently, Marshall has begun amassing an influential media empire. Having set up the contrarian website Unherd, he co-owns GB News. This culminated in his purchase of the Spectator last September for £100 million. There are rumours of a bid for the Telegraph. He is also deeply involved with the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, the conference of which was fronted by Jordan Peterson and headlined by Kemi Badenoch, Nigel Farage, Peter Thiel, Niall Ferguson and Danish skeptical environmentalist Bjørn Lomborg. I spoke to transparency campaigner Peter Geoghegan, the co-author of their superb Substack Democracy for Sale, who just published a long and in places pretty startling profile of Paul Marshall in the London Review of Books.
Quiet Riot.
Hello, Peter. Welcome back.
Hello, Alex. Great to be back. Thank you very much for having me on the show again.
Peter, I was reading this, I guess it's a profile on Paul Marshall that you just put in the London Review of Books. And okay, so there was a lot of stuff that I knew at the outset. You know, I knew he used to be a Lib Dem donor, that he was involved in the infamous Orange Book. I knew that he was sort of friends with Michael Gove. But then we got to stuff where I would, every other paragraph I would go, what? You what? And also the other extraordinary thing was the network of individuals that crop up in his various enterprises. It is like a complete spider's web in a way. So look, I will absolutely recommend that people go and read the piece. I don't particularly want to reproduce the piece, although we will touch on things in it inevitably. But what I wanted to know is, as you research a thing like that, you develop a view of a person, right? And reading through your profile, that your view of him was constantly shifting, that you were perpetually surprised by what you were finding. Is that accurate?
I think it's very accurate. I think it's a very astute observation, Alex. I said to very many people, including my partner, while I was finishing this, because it took a long time. It took longer than I would expect it to. I spent a long time researching this. I spoke to a lot of people. And I was constantly trying to figure out who exactly Paul Marshall is. And I think it's fair to say it is a profile. But unusually, for a couple of reasons. One, Paul Marshall didn't speak to me. So I put in a bid for an interview and that was turned down. I mentioned that in the piece. So I was just relying on secondary sources as well as things he'd written and said himself. So that's really what the piece is based on. It's based on interviews and things he said himself. But it's a character that's really, really hard to fill out. It's really hard to figure out exactly, at times, for want of a better phrase, is there a there there? What exactly is there? And I think you're very right to pick that up, because I didn't come away from this very long process. I came away from this process feeling like I understood a lot more about a subject that, unfortunately, it's close to my heart, which is how influence works in British politics and the various strands of that, and how a rich person can influence our public discourse. I think that the piece really shows that. But in terms of who Paul Marshall is and what exactly is driving him, I would say this is the same for almost everything that's ever been written about him. It's very, very hard to do. And one of the reasons why is that I lost count of the number of people I spoke to who said, You wouldn't know he was in the room unless you knew he was in the room. This was not somebody with a great presence, with a great amount of character, with a great amount of charisma. And that's something that even his friends would say too. And I think that actually is kind of at the nub of why he is how he is and where he's got to where he is, because he did want to be a politician. He wanted to get into electoral politics. He stood for election himself in 1987 in Fulham for the alliance, the Liberal SDP alliance, and he finished a distant third. And one of the reasons why he wasn't a distant third, I should say, my Irish accent made that sound slightly different.
I was going to say, bit rude.
Apologies. In third place. But what's fascinating about that was I think he's not somebody who had the skills, the people skills to get on in politics. No, I think it's very fair. I think it's, of all the pieces I've written in my career, I think it's one of the ones I found hardest to figure out by the end of it, where the person is. I can see where the influence is, but the person is very different.
He's quite shapeless in a way. You end up with a lot of puzzle pieces that don't seem to fit into each other in any way. It's like there is something quite big there that maybe about his private life or his upbringing that we just don't know. Like, to contrast him to, let's say, Elon Musk. The more I find out about Elon Musk's life, progress, career, background, the more it fits in this very determined shape that he has today. The more I was reading about Paul Marshall, the more questions I had. Like, what drives him? I'm genuinely not sure what drives him. One of the things is for sure religion, and we will talk about that because that was gobsmacking. But even within that envelope, I'm not sure what drives him. Like, I'm not sure what his aims are.
There's a few things I think that I would pull out from all those words as being important. One is, I think, and we saw this with the Brexit referendum, it's interesting, Marshall and Brexit. I think there's a kind of Marshall before Brexit and a Marshall after Brexit. And it was striking how many people I spoke to, the Lib Dems were like, he never really talked about Europe at all. But then he becomes a Brexiteer, he donates £100,000 to the Leave campaign. But not only that, he becomes a public face. He signs open letters calling for Brexit, which is quite an important rupture because he gives the kind of almost non-existent Liberal Leave campaign, which really is almost a misnomer. There's barely no Liberal Leave campaign. It gives that something. It's kind of, he's someone for the press as well to hang on to. But what's interesting about that is we saw during Brexit, and I wrote about it in my last book as well, the hedge funders in Brexit, kind of traditional organised city capital was anti-Brexit. The Goldman Sachs and City groups of this world actively funded the Remain campaign, which they actually don't normally give that much to politics in general. But they did for this because they were like, this is a bad thing. We don't want Brexit. But actually, the hedge funders were almost all in. We had Chris Benodi talking about waking up on the morning with the feeling of gold in his mouth. We had a lot of different hedge fund guys, Peter Geoghegan and others. And I think there's something about that kind of hedge fund mentality that, ironic as this might seem, these are very rich people with incredible access to power and wealth. They see themselves as iconoclastic. They see themselves, there's often a bit of a chip on the shoulder.
And persecuted often.
Oh, persecuted often, very much so. And within that sense, they see themselves as kind of disruptive rule breakers who see chances and seize chances where the rest of it it's a very libertarian philosophy, really. That's important. So that's number one. I think that's one thing to hold out there as important for Marshall. We'll come back to the religion. I think the religion's important. I think important as well was, I mentioned it almost in passing in the piece, but his son, Winston, who he's very close to his children. His son Winston was in Mumford & Sons. I'm sure listeners remember his son basically left Mumford & Sons, or even they had a conscious uncoupling, shall we say, after he sent a series of tweets. And I think that was a big moment for Marshall, for Paul. I think that he was already on that journey. He was already going on about woke this and trans that. He was very much there. But I think that thing with his son kind of cemented what he thinks, which is there's a clash of civilizations going on. He talks a lot about what he calls, quote, Judeo-Christianity. He's very into that language, very into this idea, which kind of does feed into his religion as well, that there's a clash of civilizations going on. So I think that's a big part of it as well. So to understand Marshall, I think they are some of the moving parts that do animation. But how the animation is not, as you say, in the way of Musk. And you can see with Musk, you can see something which I do think has happened with Marshall as well, which is online radicalization. We saw Hope Not Hate did this investigation where they found that what Marshall had done basically was he had a Twitter account. This is frankly quite a remarkable thing to have done. He had a Twitter account which had quite a few followers, mainly in the media. He then locked the Twitter account, gave it a new name, a name that kind of harked back to a poem by John Milton, and started liking and retweeting a lot of Islamophobic content, homophobic content, kind of great replacement theory content. Paul Marshall will say, look, the retweets are not endorsements, and that is true, but it gave it, at least, the very least, a sense of what kind of accounts he was interacting with. These were accounts that were very far away from the mainstream. So I think that's important for understanding Marshall too, how he's both changing the media ecosystem, but I think this is a similarity with Musk. Musk has radicalized Twitter, but Twitter has radicalized Musk.
Yes.
And I think there's an element of that with Marshall and Marshall's interest in the media.
I think that's absolutely true about Musk, and it's an extraordinary fact given that it's his algorithm that continues to radicalize him. And you're right to say that, because I got that impression as well, purely from the number of people that you spoke to that would say, I don't recognize that person in relation to the Paul Marshall I knew 5 or 10 years ago. It was almost a constant theme in the people you spoke to that I would never imagine he would, retweet something like this or say something like that. That simply doesn't tally with a person I knew, right?
Very much. That really was a constant. Like, you talk to people who knew him a long time ago, and even then would have had different politics to him. Like, his argument is, look, I'm a classical liberal, I've never changed. I think I treat that very fairly in the piece, but at the same time, I think that's the same language that Kemi Baddock and Nigel Farage use all the time. Nigel Farage always says he's a classical liberal, and you're like, what does that really mean? But that is his position. But I would talk to people who knew him 15 years ago and politically were different to him, but had a lot of time for him, frankly. Very philanthropic, which he still is. Somebody that was interested in ideas, someone whose company they quite liked, not somebody that was kind of frothing at the mouth and talking about how, clash of civilizations and decline in the West. And I think a lot of people, it's most striking with what's called ARC, the Absolute Return for Kids.
With a K or with a C?
With a K. Well, this is very interesting. There's two, exactly. Well, the one with the K is not particularly mad about the one with the C, I think, is one thing that you could definitely say.
Quite interesting.
Because ARC, A or K, actually quite a few listeners might have heard of ARC schools. They have 39 schools and academies in their trust, which is a lot. And it comes out of this moment in the early 2000s where a bunch of hedge funders, Marshall, Ian Wace, who he set up Marshall Wace, which is his hedge fund. It's a very successful hedge fund, Marshall Wace.
In part with Soros money.
In part with Soros money, yeah, 50 million, including some money from George Soros. And so they set up this hedge fund, and it's doing well. They're getting money, and they're in this space with lots of other hedge fund guys. And the hedge fund guys are basically like, we want to start giving more money to charity. They're charitably minded, but they start giving some money to charities, and like, we think we could do a better job. We're not uncommon for hedge funders. And the name ARC, in this case, ARK, is Absolute Return for Kids. So you can see that the language is there, absolute return. It's all about the return. And so they set up, they start doing a lot of things. It's quite successful. They're able to leverage a lot, especially before the financial crisis. They have these huge opulent fundraising galas, like, Prince played at one of them, the Killers played another, like big deals. And they raise a lot of money. They start doing a lot of stuff in sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Europe, but actually start doing a lot of stuff on schools in the UK. And I think Marsh was quite influential, important on that. And partly was the politics of the UK was changing with these academies. And why I'm telling you this long story is that it's quite interesting. Like, when after the story of his tweets came out, like, Marshall did stand down as the chair of ARC Schools, which is connected to this. And he's, they would say, look, and he would say, look, I was going to stand down anyway. But internally, there was a lot of unhappiness about this. There was a lot of disquiet among staff going, what's going on here? And if you talk to people who are around that project, they will go, like, I spoke to people who'd worked and left a while ago, as well as people there more recently. And they're like, look, we did a lot of good work. And there wasn't this sense that this is the people driving it held these sort of views. They were really genuinely shocked and felt like the kind of constant refrain was, I don't understand how he got here. Like, this doesn't reflect the person I used to know.
That to me made sense. And there is actually a lot in the piece and through his life. Education is a running theme. He takes a great interest in schools, in obscure universities, in educational organizations. Everything is presented in many ways through an educational prism. And that to me made sense, because if his main issue is that he thinks academia and education has been captured by a particular leftist way of thinking that is very dangerous, then what he has done as a venture capitalist is gone out there and taken action. He's created and is creating still his own empire of alternative education in many ways, right?
I think there's two things going on with his interest in education. Education, I think, in Marshall is really interesting. There's two things. I think that's what you're describing is the second thing, and that's happened more recently, and it's real for sure. So he gave £18 million to a thing called Ralston College, which is an unaccredited liberal arts college, small college in Savannah, Georgia. They kind of set themselves up as the free speech college. It only has 7 full-time staff and a handful of students, and he's given £18 million to it. Why? Maybe why is because Jordan Peterson is the chancellor, so he's really putting a lot of money into that. But behind that as well is there's another point about education in Marsh, which I think is about why he set up ARC or why he's so involved in that. He has a very hardline classicalist liberal, if you want to call it, laissez-faire view of the state as well. Like I found lots of I was interested in going through the archives and the cuttings of his occasional columns and opinion pieces he would have written 10, 15 years ago during austerity, where he's calling for more austerity. He was very much on the right wing of the Lib Dems even then. His worldview is one in which the job of the state is to provide education for people to a standard where they can all participate in the market economy. And after that, the state falls away. Once you are of adult age, adult competences, and the state has provided you with the necessary support to realize your own kind of version of Abraham Maslow's self-actualization, that is really the job of the state done. And that, I think, is really important for his context, because actually ARC schools have been really, really transformative for many people. They operate mainly in parts of the country with serious multiple deprivation, actually often in places with really very, very diverse, more diverse than the kind of average in the country, places with high SEN numbers of students. And that kind of does speak to that bit, which is kind of rooted in that view that Marshall has. So the two things I think go on, and I think his interest in primary and secondary education is rooted mainly in the first ones, which still exist, this bit about the state. The secondary education, the university education at third level stuff is actually all about this idea that we have lost universities. Ironically, he actually gave £80 million to LSE, who named a building after him, the Marshall Building, and this didn't make the piece, but hilariously, most people in LSE who come to LSE have no idea that it's named after Paul Marshall. There's a number of actually really senior economists named Marshall in the history of Britain. So at LSE, it's kind of a running joke that the Marshall Building, nobody knows it's Paul Marshall. But he did do that. I think it's interesting, though, he's moved off giving money to the likes of LSE and is now funding things like these American colleges, which are more and more at the kind of the hard nose of the culture.
Well, that's the other pattern I observed, but I want actually to come back to this at the end, because I think it is a big question about him.
Quiet Riot.
This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other toppings, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
Quiet Riot.
The second strand that runs through almost everything is religion. And this really did take me by surprise. First of all, because actually I genuinely had no idea that proper evangelical religion is such a big deal in the UK and growing. And secondly, because again, if you look at the connections to other people through Holy Trinity Brompton, which is the church he belongs to, like I had no idea that Justin Welby was part of that. Then that fell out with the Church of England because effectively it saw Church of England as woke before really woke was a thing. This was several years ago. And so did that aspect surprise you? Or did you know that about Paul Marshall, that he is heavy into religion?
Well, so I will credit, and I quote him in the piece, and I spoke to him a lot when I was writing it, Andrew Greystone, who's a theologian and a writer. He wrote an excellent book called Bleeding for Jesus, which is all about John Smythe, which was the scandal that eventually brought down Justin Welby. And Andrew wrote a piece in Prospect last year called The Marshall Plan, which is a very good forensic account of his Marshall's religion, his religious beliefs. So that kind of was one of the things that put me onto that track. But I was also really struck how many people knew very little about it. And in many ways, what I tried to do, as well as kind of go over some of the ground that Andrew had, was to try and exactly ask that question. How many people, how did people know about this? And what was striking, especially talking to former Lib Dems, was how completely, and some of these are religious Lib Dems, how totally surprised they've been by Marshall's subsequent religion. So Marshall's been worshipping at Holy Church Trinity Brompton since 1997.
Interesting year, that.
A very interesting year. Yeah, indeed. And it's also the year he sets up his hedge fund. So a busy year for Paul. What's interesting, though, as well about it is speaking to people in the Lib Dems, they were like, well, one former MP said to me, I didn't even know he was religious, never mind evangelical. So there's that aspect of it. The Lib Dems have often had a evangelical side, Tim Farron and others, but they've often sat on the left of the party. So Marshall was in quite an odd position too, in that he was almost like a quiet evangelical within the Lib Dems who wasn't aligned with the actual, what would have been seen as the religious people in the Lib Dems, like Simon Hughes as well, who were religious. So that side of him was very much kind of downplayed during his time with the Lib Dems. But more generally, I think what we've seen subsequently is a changing role of religion in British politics. On one level, you could say, look, Britain is an incredibly secular society. We've just had our first, we don't really talk about it, by my reckoning, it's our first atheist prime minister in Keir Starmer. Religion doesn't take a big part of public life. But I think we can actually start to see some of these changes over the last few years. Like on one level, structurally, actually Britain does. The king is the head of the church.
Yeah.
The leading bishops sit in the House of Lords, etc., etc. But also, I think there's also something else happening that we're starting to see more of. Like you could see it with the other arc, the quote-unquote Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, which Marshall funds, which had its big conference a couple of weeks ago and got a huge amount of airtime. Kimmy Badenoch was there, Nigel Farage. Kimmy Badenoch talking about how you had to vote Conservative to save Western civilization.
Okay, so on ARC, I did want to read a little bit from the piece. I did find this collection of people astounding. Quoting from the piece, ARC isn't explicitly religious, but its leadership attests to the mingling of faith and politics on the fringes of the right. Its CEO, Philippa Stroud, a Conservative peer, is married to David Stroud, founder of the charismatic megachurch network Christchurch London. Members of the advisory board include the Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson, the failed Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy, the former Australian Prime Ministers John Howard and Tony Abbott, the Blue Labour founder Maurice Glassman, who attended Trump's inauguration and in January told Steve Bannon's podcast that progressives are the enemy, and the Spectator associate editor Douglas Murray. I was astounded just by this collection of people who have come now under this umbrella, and of course Jordan Peterson at the head of it all. So that is really the current network, isn't it? That is the heart of his interests.
I think that's actually a really good summation of where his interests are. And if you look at how he was described what ARC does, actually, I think I've got it in front of me too. Like, if you look at how he describes what ARC does, it's a response to what he calls an elite class in the West, scaring the living daylights out of us, always looking for the bad in things, undermining our self-confidence by trying to make us fearful of the future, ashamed of our history and our culture. And you saw a lot of that at this conference, a lot of this talk about how we were rethinking ridiculous claims, frankly, we're rethinking civilization, etc. But if you pare it back and look at what you're talking about, and the people you've listed there, what you're talking about is social conservatism, large aspects of faith, of religion, and a desire to put religion far more into politics. Like Philippa Stroud, I think it's not a coincidence she's the CEO. She headed up, if you remember, the Centre for Social Justice under Ian Duncan Smith, which was very influential in pushing very punitive policies actually around disabled people in government. But that was very much a very strong nexus there. Feeding into, I think we are seeing much more of aspects of religion coming into our politics. We've seen it in the debate, I think, around assisted dying as well. And people like Danny Kruger and Miriam Cates have also given talks at ARC as well. These former and current Conservative MPs or evangelical Christians. There's a sense in which wanting consciously to kind of mirror, to speak to what's happening in the United States. And in the US, obviously, the US is different. The role of evangelical Christianity in American politics is really strong. I think it's different in the UK. But I think what partly ARC is trying to do is to build this kind of wide network as well. Like you've read out all those names, almost all those people occupy different spaces in the political network, in the political kind of idea space. And I think that's part of what's happening. And I think ARC, to me at least, from looking at Marshall, is really where Marshall is trying to take politics and where he wants to take it and where he's interested in taking it.
And this is, I guess, the bit that did make sense. And the bit I did buy of what he's written, the fact that he's politically homeless, that's the bit I bought, actually, because he's been in loads of parties, he's rubbed elbows with a lot of powerful politicians, he's constantly trying to find a home for his politics and he can't. And it seems to me that from reading that narrative, at some point he decided that if there wasn't a home for his politics, he was going to create one. And this is where you see him suddenly then expand into media.
I think there's definitely something, I think there's, that would be my take too. I think he is genuinely, rightly sees himself as politically homeless. He tried with the Lib Dems. I think even with the Conservatives, he donated money under Boris Johnson. I think that was probably primarily motivated by his desires around Brexit. It's one of the reasons I end the piece by saying he's unlikely to, his friends say he's unlikely to start donation to party politics again. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because he understands how actually sometimes the smartest way to buy influence, and I think this is increasingly true, not just in British politics, but in politics around the world, isn't by giving money to political parties. There's much better ways to influence politics if you have real money. That's one reason. And the second is I don't think there is anybody out there that he looks at and goes, yeah, you are the people I want to give money to. You are the kind of people who do reflect my views to an extent that I want to put my name on top of you.
So what do you think, in what direction, as it were, is this media empire of GB News, Unherd, Spectator now heading? Is he going to attempt to include the Telegraph in this family?
So on the second question first on the Telegraph, it was interesting. I asked somebody close to Marshall about this, who's involved with Marshall's Old Street Media Group, which is the kind of name, the umbrella name for his various media interests. And it's worth mentioning that Marshall, unusually for a kind of media baron, most media barons, they're media barons first and have other interests, but the media is the thing that they are interested in. That's not the case with Marshall. His first ever interest in media was Unherd, the website which he founded and funded in 2017, which is not that long ago, really. So he's quite a recent convert to media landscape. And one of the reasons people don't really invest in media these days is because there's no money in it. So in terms of Spectator, and I spoke to somebody who's very much close to Marshall, they refuse to deny that they no interest in the Spectator anymore. So formally, he's no longer bidding for it, but it's a bit of a mess. And I'd say it depends what it looks like in the shakedown. I'd say Marshall still probably has, if the right opportunity were to come along for the Spectator, and that mightn't just be financial. I think it's probably as much about politics as anything else. Because he did overpay.
You mean the Telegraph?
Sorry, for the Telegraph. My apologies. And I think that isn't so much financial as it is as the politics of it too. Like he overpaid for the Spectator, so I don't think he's immune to overpaying for the Telegraph. I think it just depends on if he thinks it can do things that he wanted to do. So I think that's a real possibility. I think it's not in any way a given, but it's there as an option. And I think there's two ways of looking at. And if you speak to people, I think it depends whether people are inside the media or outside the media. And I think people who are inside the media often have a tendency, like media correspondents or anybody else, understandably, to treat media as a business on its own terms, purely as a business. And I think often not to consider all that much the influence side of it. They look at the pounds, shillings, and pence, and media owners, are they trying to make, how much money have they made or not made? And so if you talk to people in that world, they'll look at it and say, I think this is probably true of Marshall. There's where are the opportunities for growth for the Spectator? It's not probably in the UK, but maybe in the US, they've definitely ramped up resources in the US in recent years. Similarly, Unherd, about 50% of its audience is in the US. I spoke to people, I reported in the piece that shortly after he bought the Spectator, a couple of days later, Marshall went and gave a talk, an all-staff talk, in which he talked about left-wing bias in the broadcast media, but also talked about the opportunities for the Spectator to grow. And I think that will be, that is a place where the Spectator potentially could grow. Marshall, I'm sure, does not want to, if he can avoid it, lose money. I think that's probably true, as it is of anybody else. But by the same token, I think there's a part of where his media interests are that just can't be purely understood in terms of buying up an asset and trying to make X money out of an asset before selling it on or doing something else with it. I think it does transcend that, because GB News, for example, they've just announced losses over 100 million.
Yeah.
Now their losses are humongous. They're absolutely ginormous. And if you look at one way of paralleling this is with Rupert Murdoch. There's a read that says Marshall's the new Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch, after GB News launched, he'd always wanted to have a right-wing TV channel in the UK. It had worked really well for him in Fox in the US, done lots of good work for him. He wanted to do it in the UK. He set up Talk TV after GB News. He quickly realised that this was just a money pit. He brought in Piers Morgan on a huge salary. Nobody was watching. It was bad TV. It looked like crap. It was embarrassing. It was embarrassing at News International. People involved in News International didn't want to be seen near it. And he pulled the plug. He pulled the plug pretty quickly. Marshall is not doing that. There used to be three backers of GB News. There was Marshall, there was Discovery, the US channel, and there was Legatum, the Legatum Ventures, which is Christopher Chandler, who's a New Zealand-born hedge fund billionaire who lives in Dubai. He's not registered. He can't vote in the UK, as far as I'm aware, and can't make political donations, but he can spend a lot of money on TV channels. Discovery is gone, so it's just Marshall and Chandler. So you have two very rich people who are spending a hell of a lot of money on a product that shows no sign of making any money back. And that, to me, suggests that you can't take Marshall's media holdings just in terms of pounds, shillings, and pence and looking to try and find a new market for X, Y, and Z here. A traditional media outlet will tend to change its political persuasion and perspectives to try and find markets rather than the other way around. I think what you're going to see with Marshall's holdings, I could see them becoming more interested in the US. You can already start to see it, trying to speak to an American audience. But at the same time, I think what that also does is build on these sort of links that exist in things like ARC. It kind of coalesce with giving money to the Ralston College in the US. And there's an element of kind of creating yourself as a bit of a transatlantic media magnet. And I think that's part of what it's doing. And it's getting, I mentioned towards the end of the piece that the last time ARC was on in the UK for its big conference in 2023, it got almost no media coverage. No one really cared. There was a couple of small pieces in Politico. There was not very much about it. This time around, not only did it get a lot of coverage when it happened, before it was on, Marshall was interviewed by the FT. It was his second page of the FT weekend, which was read by a lot of people, because it was framed as GB News backer. And all the piece was just him kicking net zero, talking about how terrible net zero is. And that is because he is the backer of GB News. If he was just a hedge fund guy, he wouldn't get that. And when you become a media player like this, you transcend that old space of being a hedge fund guy. You could be a much richer hedge fund guy than Rupert Murdoch is and not get heard of. And I think Marshall's I don't think you would do this. You wouldn't start to make all these media plays if you didn't want to start to push the politics in this way.
Peter, it's just extraordinary. I mean, we've only scratched the surface, and I got the impression from your piece that you were only scratching the surface in that anyway of all your research. So I'm sure there will be follow-ups on the Substack. We know the way that politics and money and media and think tanks sort of interface behind the scenes. But like I said, to plug in to a UK context that extra piece of religion and that active effort to say, effectively, we got to get them while they're young, I think is a big step in a slightly different direction. We'll speak again very, very soon. I'm sure people will read the piece and have loads of questions for you online. Thank you. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much, Alex. Yeah, no, I think there's a lot more in it. I'm hoping to write something this week about this on the Substack about it too, as much just summarising some of my own thoughts on it. But I think, as we saw again with the ARC thing recently, I think Paul Marshall is unlikely to start to fade away as a presence in our politics. Quite the opposite.
I sense that.
Quiet Riot.
The Guardian reports that on the fringes of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship's conference, a meeting took place. It included Munira Mirza, Boris Johnson's policy advisor in various positions and for many years. Among the dinner were said to be Michael Gove and Rebecca Brooks. The topic? A plan to fund a new generation of journalists through a scheme of apprenticeships. The project will be non-partisan, we are assured, as many projects involving only right-wing figures are. The Barclay brothers paid 15 times operating profit for the Spectator in 2005. The Economist was valued at 16 times operating profit when its minority shareholders bought the senior partner out. Paul Marshall has paid around 38 times the operating profit of The Spectator to buy it. GB News just posted over £30 million of losses in the financial year to April 2024, meaning its total losses since launch now top £100 million, and yet the money keeps flowing in. It is a pretty inevitable conclusion that the transaction here is not a purely business investment, just as it was not for Elon Musk when he overpaid by orders of magnitude for Twitter. What is being bought is influence, and it is a hangover of Thatcherism to consider state involvement inherently wicked, while private capital de facto benign. The US was probably rightly worried about Chinese state involvement in TikTok, but Elon Musk paying over the odds to buy a presidency is A-OK apparently. The British government got involved to block a consortium that involved United Arab Emirates money from buying The Spectator. They were justifiably concerned about its motives and agenda. But should the motives and agenda of an individual buying what is considered by many to be the Conservative Party's in-house magazine not be subject to similar scrutiny? To what extent will we allow private money to corrupt an essential pillar of democracy, the flow of accurate information, before becoming a little bit more alert to the dangers? If you enjoy Quiet Riot and you can afford to support us, you can do so at ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod for as little as £5. And if you want to bung us 100 million quid, we might just think about selling the podcast to you. This is Alex Andreou. Bis gleich.
Quiet.